Good morning, SBI Nation. Today we are excited to be talking to you about a new topic where we're going to be discussing the future of wholesale distribution and specifically what it means to your go-to-market. This is a timely topic as we are all living with the output of the pandemic and some of the changes that has had on distribution and how the world is changing around us. So I am excited to be joined by one of our foremost experts in this area, Grant Dismore. Grant, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Tony. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. We're so excited that you can join us today. So for the audience, Grant has a long tenured history at the likes of Coca-Cola, Cadbury Schweppes, Dr. Pepper, Interstate Batteries, where he's held a variety of positions across operations, strategy, supply chain, and definitely an expert in this field. So we wanted to bring him in to talk a little bit about how the changing dynamic of the supply chain is going to impact the way that consumers, businesses, and everyone purchases products, and more importantly, how it's going to impact customers like you who are getting those products to market. So, Grant, let's dive into the first segment. So, first question for you, Grant, is when we think about the digital marketplace and how the digital marketplace of the future is going to complement the brick and mortar infrastructure, where do you see that going and what changes do you see coming out of the recent pandemic that are never going to return to the way things have worked in the past?
Well, great question, because really, if you just think about, step out of the detail for a moment, digital really is enabling new competitors that leverage new business models and really change the basis of competition, Tony. If you just think about this today, the sort of mindset of instant gratification when we order something, any kind of home goods, and gets delivered to our door, sometimes the same day, in most instances the next day, and obviously I'm talking about Amazon Prime, that mindset of instant gratification is absolutely bleeding into the workplace now. And that same expectation of sort of this delivery culture that is forming rapidly is certainly impacting the traditional way of distributing product across all industries.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about that, because when I think about instant gratification, my wife gives me a hard time because I think the pandemic has been good for her. She's one who's happy to be, binge watching something on Netflix or reading a great book or just hanging out in the house. Meanwhile, I've always been the person who is all about instant gratification. I'll go to the big box stores, I'll go purchase something that I don't even need, but there's just something about getting it right then and right there. And it's interesting to see this change, because now I see companies like Peloton or like Tesla who don't have a fleet of inventory at the store, but there's just enough for a consumer to look at it, to try it, to see what it's like, to make a decision, and then it comes to you after the fact with some sort of a white glove setup brought right to your doorstep. So to me, that's been a fascinating change, and I would love your perspective on, are those one-offs that we're really seeing that, or is that going to become a new norm where these large car dealerships are going to go away from that and go to these high traffic malls or outdoor shopping areas where they're only going to have a couple of models as opposed to an inventory of 1,000 models that I can pick anything?
I think the best way to describe this, at least from my perspective, is think about Amazon, right? So the early days of Amazon, where essentially they sold books only, books online. Very, very smart move in the sense that they didn't carry any inventory whatsoever. And of course, it was the book publishers that was shipping the product directly to the consumer who was making the purchase online. Wonderful business model, created a tremendous amount of cash flow for Amazon in the early days, for them to be able to use that as a springboard and do what they're doing. To get to your question, though, I do think, though, Tony, there are very specific, let's call them categories, where the consumer absolutely wants to put their eyes, touch, feel certain goods, right? Large purchases at the end of the day, sort of sight unseen, is always a difficult pill to swallow for consumers, generally speaking. But if you have a look at the medium of digital in the sense that consumers are spending a tremendous amount of time, if not necessarily buying your typical, transactional household goods, whether it's cleaners, potentially even groceries, etc., batteries online, and so on. There are certain items where they absolutely want to go and see these things in store. However, the what we would call these sort of spontaneous, gut feel purchase is not necessarily done in store any longer because a tremendous amount of time is spent online researching. And if not necessarily researching a product, certainly looking to get reviews and understand what other consumers feel and believe about a product or a good that you might be particularly interested in. So this sort of dynamic of, the guys that do it the best, and I'll give you an example. AutoZone, for example, 5,000 retail stores, heavy investment in bricks and mortar, yet their online presence and the amount of time, effort, and resources that they're putting into online capabilities, not just to have consumers purchase their goods online, but in some instances creating new markets by, for example, joining forces with Walmart, where today you can go onto the advanced website, search for a product, research a product, and then even purchase it online, but then go and pick it up either at your local Walmart or at your local advanced store. So just this proliferation of digital, where you're really meeting the consumer where the consumer is shopping. That's the way that I look about it, is consumers are shopping in different places. So much of it today is obviously online. And so those companies that have, traditionally been your traditional wholesale distribution, traditional retail business, to be able to leverage the network they have with, of course, significant investment, and I guess just providing the opportunity for their shoppers to, be able to access their goods and their services digitally.
It's interesting that you talk about that, because I wholeheartedly see it as a consumer firsthand, how it's changing in the consumable space, or even in the high-end, automotive or large purchase space, again, as a consumer in a B2C motion. But I would also say that this is transcending into the B2B motion across all industries. When I think about technology, 20 years ago, distributors, their big value was that they distributed the product, they warehoused it, they made it available to the resellers, and in that two-tier distribution model, they had the capacity available so that the resellers didn't have to house it. Now, in a world of SaaS or downloadable software, there's less, from a typical warehousing perspective, but more in terms of value add, in terms of, pulling together consumer groups, pulling together events, creating demand, which really takes me into the concept of, as you disrupt the supply chain and you can go directly from the manufacturer to the end user, whether it's a business or a consumer, there's fundamentally got to be a change in how demand gets generated. So I'd love some thoughts from your side, whether you think about it from a B2C or a B2B perspective. How will we create demand in the future to be able to generate demand in this new model where we're no longer, directly attached to the supply chain, and we've fundamentally disrupted the supply chain and the logistics around getting the product to the end user?
Well, and I think again, the answer really lies in the fact that the sort of traditional wholesale value chain as we know it is obviously being disrupted for a number of different reasons. So when you talk about creating demand, it's again, we always talk about Amazon in this space because they're obviously disrupting so many aspects of these value chains. But if you think about, Jeff Bezos talks about sort of what he calls, and I'll quote, customer obsession, right? And just sort of really meeting the customer at their point of need, if you will. When you talk about creating demand, there are companies, let's take Uber as an example, right? Uber is a wonderful example where they're obviously growing new sales, I'll call it via their traditional channel. But again, they're just this sort of mindset of the consumer where everything, they tell me that over 81% of purchases are now made from a cell phone, let alone a desktop or an iPad. Everything is obviously right there. And so these traditional companies, and we talk about Uber as an example, Uber, if you just think about what they've done, they have created new volume, new sales using their existing platform. Think about it, you've got Uber Eats, right? So besides the traditional peer ride-sharing platform that they originally started, you talk about Uber Eats. To date, the numbers are projected to deliver over $10 billion in food revenue in 2020. I mean, that's just phenomenal. Think about that 3 or 4 years ago, right? It wasn't there. And when you talk about supplier, what I would call disintermediation, and obviously creating demand, let's talk about the tire industry for a moment. So, the big guys like Goodyear and Bridgestone, they had the traditional wholesale distribution from manufacturer to retail. Obviously, what they've done now is essentially create their own distribution network, if you will, by partnering together, first of all, and launching what today we know as Tire Hub. So think about that again, all online. The consumer simply goes in and types tires, if you will, and it's all about positioning, as you well know, as always, right? Online, buying that buy box as best you can. But on that site, you can obviously now put in the vehicle, just even your license plate number, for example, and it's going to give you a selection of tires. It's going to give you installers where you can actually either reserve an installation appointment online, pay for the transaction online, and in some instances, even have the installer come to your driveway or to your place of work, mostly driveway these days, and actually install those tires. So my point there is that obviously the manufacturers of Goodyear and Bridgestone have disintermediated, and unfortunately in this case, the traditional American tire distributors, just a few years ago, as a result of this, had to declare bankruptcy. So it's meeting the consumer where they shop. And so much more of this is now taking place online. And of course, that's where the demand is being created.
So love that example. And, thinking about the tire industry, when we think about disintermediaries and what they're doing, from my perspective, I think about it from price elasticity and up and down. You got surge pricing on Uber for peak periods when supply and demand are not correlated. And then you've got, volume that you see the likes of Amazon or Tire Rack or others that you've talked about. So as I think about the buyer's journey and how they're going to buy in this new model with a disrupted supply chain, how does price elasticity get resolved? How do you decide if you're in premium pricing or volume/discount pricing? And how do you know which buyer's journey you're on at any given moment in a constantly changing environment?
I'll say, at least in my opinion, that the buyer's role is today incredibly challenging for one reason alone, and that is that there is, cut to the chase in terms of, when you look at your P&L, there was eroding margins due to pricing transparency. So the buyers, great question, and it's a significant, very real challenge today because, again, I'll give you an example. When you look at Honeywell launched Go Direct, B2B marketplace, again, all online, creating transparency in $4 billion worth of aerospace parts for Honeywell specifically. Their goal is to have 100 leading companies with storefronts on that same Go Direct Trade website, if you will, and can it be a new marketplace. So the point is that once again, the proliferation of digital in this particular instance and topic around pricing is creating a tremendous amount of transparency, which of course is putting pressure on margins, as you can well imagine. So the buyer's role today is more critical than ever. And it's tough. I mean, once again, the consumer who's taking the time and making the effort can clearly understand and see, in a lot more transparent way today, the pricing dynamics in the marketplace.
So Grant, those are some fascinating insights, and I loved your analogy there and your pulling in of the digital concept. One of the things SBI has done as part of our annual research report is we've actually introduced a digital maturity model, helping customers think about how they are going to digitally enable their go-to-market and all the components using your typical 1 to 5 maturity model ranking across each of those areas to understand and help customers become more digitally mature. Because I think this conversation, as well as many others, would only further epitomize the need for stronger digital content, stronger digital enablement, because the buyer's journey, is changing, and it's changing right before us, and it's going to continue to evolve, and it's going to create a great opportunity. Some companies will, accelerate through it and create great opportunity for themselves and their shareholders, and others will be completely cannibalized in this transformation. So it's a fascinating topic. We really appreciate you joining us today. And to all of our viewers out there, we want to thank you again for tuning in to the SBI TV show. And as always, we wish you the best of luck as you try to make your number.